Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, September 8th, 2022. Queen Elizabeth II has died at the age of 96 after a record 70-year reign in Great Britain. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, calling her the rock on which modern Britain was built. U.S. President Joe Biden saying the Queen was more than a monarch, she defined an era. Coming up, tributes to Queen Elizabeth, and we'll talk with C-SPAN's Westminster producer Peter Knowles about what happens now, the days of mourning and the funeral for the Queen, and the welcoming of the new King, Charles III. Steve Bannon, former senior strategist of former President Donald Trump, pleading not guilty in New York State to accusations he raised money to build portions of a U.S.-Mexico border wall and then took the money himself. He calls the charges phony charges. The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell reiterating his stance that tough and aggressive action now to bring down high inflation is the right course before the high inflation starts to feel like the norm. Unionized freight railroad workers could go on strike soon. We'll talk about this with a business reporter at The Hill about how that might affect the U.S. economy and supply chains and the role the Biden administration is playing in the labor negotiations. And the U.S. sending hundreds of millions of dollars more in military aid to Ukraine and pledging another $2 billion for Ukraine and European countries surrounding it that could be under threat from the Russian military. This from BBC News. Queen Elizabeth II, the UK's longest-serving monarch, has died at Balmoral, aged 96, after reigning for 70 years. Her family gathered at her Scottish estate after concerns grew about her health earlier on Thursday. The Queen came to the throne in 1952 and witnessed enormous social change. With her death, her eldest son Charles, the former Prince of Wales, will lead the country in mourning as the new king and head of state for 14 Commonwealth realms. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow. That reporting from BBC News. In London, outside the Prime Minister's residence, 10 Downing Street, the British Prime Minister Liz Truss with some words.
We are all devastated by the news that we have just heard from Balmoral. The death of Her Majesty the Queen is a huge shock to the nation and to the world. Queen Elizabeth II was the rock on which modern Britain was built. Our country has grown and flourished under her reign. Britain is the great country it is today because of her. She ascended the throne just after the Second World War. She championed the development of the Commonwealth from a small group of 7 countries to a family of 56 nations, spanning every continent of the world. We are now a modern, thriving, dynamic nation. Through thick and thin, Queen Elizabeth II provided us with the stability and the strength that we needed. She was the very spirit of Great Britain, and that spirit will endure. She has been our longest ever reigning monarch. It's an extraordinary achievement to have presided with such dignity and grace for 70 years. Her life of service stretched beyond most of our living memories. In return, she was loved and admired by the people in the United Kingdom and all around the world. She has been a personal inspiration to me and to many Britons. Her devotion to duty is an example to us all. Earlier this week, at 96, she remained determined to carry out her duties as she appointed me as her 15th Prime Minister. Throughout her life, she's visited more than 100 countries, and she has touched the lives of millions around the world. In the difficult days ahead, we will come together with our friends across the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth, and the world to celebrate her extraordinary lifetime of service. It is a day of great loss, but Queen Elizabeth II leaves a great legacy. Today, the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty, King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him. to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
The British Prime Minister Liz Truss outside the Prime Minister's residence in London, 10 Downing Street. Every living U.S. president and former president paying a tribute to the late Queen. President Joe Biden with a statement that begins, "Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was more than a monarch. She defined an era. In a world of constant change, she was a steadying presence and a source of comfort and pride for generations of Britons, including many who have never known their country without her. An enduring admiration for Queen Elizabeth II united people across the Commonwealth. The 7 decades of her history-making reign bore witness to an age of unprecedented human advancement and the forward march of human dignity." And this from former U.S. President Donald Trump. Queen Elizabeth's historic and remarkable reign left a tremendous legacy of peace and prosperity for Great Britain. Her leadership and enduring diplomacy secured and advanced alliances with the United States and countries around the world. However, she will always be remembered for her faithfulness to her country and her unwavering devotion to her fellow countrymen and women. Here in Washington on Capitol Hill, U.S. Senate leaders with their condolences. First, the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
Today, we take a solemn and somber pause. A few minutes ago, we learned the sad news of the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. I join with Leader McConnell, with my Senate colleagues, and with all Americans to offer deepest sympathies and prayers to the royal family and to the people of the United Kingdom. I never had the honor of meeting Her Majesty the Queen myself, but I admired much about her until the very end. It's hard to fathom that today we have to say goodbye, because after all, most Americans, to say nothing of the British people, have never lived in a world without Her Majesty the Queen. It is a marvel to think that on the day of Her Majesty's coronation, Harry Truman was in the White House. The world was still coming out of the shadow of the Second World War, entering a bold, uncertain, uncharted future. In her time, she came to know 15 different prime ministers, 14 U.S. presidents, traveled to well over 100 countries, and made over 200 official state visits. She was the first British monarch ever to address a joint session of Congress, and thanks to her, the special relationship between the United States and the UK gained even more special significance. Her reign saw the dawn of the atomic age, the age of the internet, the fall of the Soviet Union, an unprecedented global pandemic. She didn't just witness the great turns of history, she helped shape them over the 7 decades of her reign. And every step of the way, she was precisely the kind of leader the moment demanded. In times of hardship, she was both strong and comforting. In times of joy, she was gracious and dignified. She was a rock, the living embodiment of the virtues that lie at the core of the nation she so proudly led. I dare say we will never see a leader quite like her for as long as we live. So today, we join the people of the UK and the royal family in mourning the loss of Her Majesty the Queen. May she rest in peace.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor in Washington. Also remembering the Queen, the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky.
Today, all Americans stand with our great friends across the Atlantic in mourning the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Our deepest sympathies are with the royal family and the many millions of people across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth and the entire world who've drawn reassurance and inspiration from her historic reign, sterling character, and shining example. For 70 long years, from the aftermath of World War II well into the 21st century, across 15 different prime ministers, through great triumphs and great challenges, the Queen's steady leadership safeguarded the land she loved. Despite spending nearly 3/4 of a century as one of the most famous and admired individuals on the entire planet, the Queen made sure her reign was never really about herself, not about her fame or her feelings or her personal wants or needs. She guided venerable institutions through modern times using timeless virtues like duty, dignity, and sacrifice. She offered our contemporary world a living master class that it needed badly. Of particular importance to all Americans, the decades of Her Majesty's reign saw an intense deepening of the special relationship and close bond between the United States and the United Kingdom. The Queen met sitting President Harry S. Truman when she was a 25-year-old princess. She went on to meet with a dozen more of our presidents during her reign. She presided over a period of historic strengthening of the alliance between our nations that has changed the course of world history for the better. So, Madam President, today the Senate and the American people are joined with our dear friends across the ocean. We're joined in prayer. We're joined in grief and in gratitude for such a remarkable leader and such a successful reign.
U.S. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, on the Senate floor. C-SPAN's Westminster producer has been covering the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Peter Knowles now joining us from London. Thanks again for being with us. It's been a long time since there's been a royal succession in Great Britain. What happens now, the passing of the Queen, mourning that, and then welcoming the new king?
We know quite a bit about the process, but not everything. And that's partly to do with the fact that it is now 70 years since this was last undertaken. That's a very long time. No one has living memory of how everything works, and obviously some things have had to be updated. What we think's the process is something like this. We know that the period of public mourning starts tomorrow and will last 10 days. So that gives a pretty big clue as to when the state funeral will be held, though that hasn't been announced. The really important things are that, and I think this is going to be tomorrow, there is to be what's called an accession council. This is the king with privy councillors, so senior members of the government, in which he makes a declaration and swears an oath. What the oath is to the preservation of the Church of Scotland. And this is the point at which he is then proclaimed as king, and God Save the King is sung for the first time in 70 years. So that's a major step. We think it's quite possible that Parliament tomorrow will have tributes, but that has not been announced yet, so we don't know that for sure. But Parliament is due to sit tomorrow, so either it simply adjourns or there may be tributes. So as you can tell, there's quite a lot in flux, a lot that hasn't been announced yet, and it's being worked out. In fact, I understand there is a meeting going on right now to deal with these and many other matters. The
new Prime Minister just formed the government, the Queen giving her permission. Does that stay in place, or does that have to be redone with the new king?
Yes, everything continues. I believe the MPs will most likely be asked to swear an oath of allegiance to the new king. But the process of admitting the new government ministers, which was continuing, in fact, today, is that process in the House of Commons, at least, is complete. There are ministers to be appointed in the House of Lords, and the king will be the person who approves those government appointments. So you're right, this has come at quite a tricky time, because we had a new Prime Minister only on Tuesday, and today is Thursday. So there's a lot in flux, and there was the most enormous government announcement only this morning about price controls for energy. So the government is in the middle of doing a lot of really big and difficult things, but most government business, apart from that which is absolutely essential, now stops, is paused, as though this was an election period. As part of the public mourning, there'll be as few announcements and as few actions as possible over the next 10 days.
As somebody living in Great Britain, what is the feeling of losing a queen after 70 years and thinking about her legacy?
It's quite profound. There are very, very many people who would say, well, I'm no monarchist, but... And it's quite a telling phrase, because it means that there is a very widespread and deep appreciation of the Queen and her lifetime of service, her absolute dedication to the role that was completely unwavering and very not showy. It was the opposite of a celebrity lifestyle. And that's the end of that era is very profound. People are shocked and saddened. A lot of people are gathering at Buckingham Palace, as well as people gathering at other royal palaces, including Balmoral, where the Queen died. And I have to tell you that one of the things that's shocking here is the language, because for the first time in our lives we're hearing "God Save the King," and references to the king will do this, the king will do that, and that comes as quite a shock. We simply haven't heard that, not in my lifetime. So yes, it's a very, very big, profound, and sad moment.
We're talking with C-SPAN's Westminster producer, Peter Knowles. You made a bit of reference to this. What is the state of the popular approval for the monarchy itself? How much support does it have? And this kind of comes up when there's a transition. Yes,
there is, I would say, a minimal Republican movement in this country. I mean, I would struggle to name to you those MPs who would self-identify as Republicans. It's negligible. So whether it's, we'll find out, won't we, whether this support for the monarchy was really support for a person or support for this way of doing things. Because we're all aware that it's a slightly strange way of doing things, that your head of state passes without any intervention by the public, any kind of process. At the moment of the Queen's death, Charles became king. The only decision that was to be made at that point is what he called himself, because new kings have the right to choose any of their first names as their regal name. But he stuck with the name that he's borne for the last 73 years, which is Charles, and became King Charles. But as things stand, there is no anti-monarchical, pro-Republican movement that I've ever noticed in this country.
Peter Knowles, a C-SPAN's Westminster producer, joining us from London. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Queen Elizabeth II made many trips to the U.S. over her 70 years on the throne. In 1991, she was invited to address a joint session of Congress.
Your Congress and our Parliament are the twin pillars of our civilizations. and the chief among the many treasures that we have inherited from our predecessors. We, like you, are staunch believers in the freedom of the individual and the rule of a fair and just law. These principles are shared with our European partners and with the wider Atlantic community. They are the bedrock of the Western world. Some people believe that power grows from the barrel of a gun. So it can, but history shows that it never grows well, nor for very long. Force in the end is sterile. We have gone a better way. Our societies rest on mutual agreement, on contract, and on consensus. A significant part of your social contract is written down in your Constitution. Ours rests on custom and will. The spirit behind both, however, is precisely the same. It is the spirit of democracy. These ideals are clear enough, but they must never be taken for granted. They have to be protected and nurtured through every change and fluctuation.
Queen Elizabeth II speaking to a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress in Washington in 1991. From C-SPAN's video library, you can find her full speech at our website, cspan.org. Queen Elizabeth II dying today at the age of 96. This is Washington Today. A story from Associated Press. Former President Trump's longtime ally Steve Bannon pleaded not guilty Thursday to duping donors who gave money to build a wall on the U.S. southern border, a state-level reboot of a federal case that ended with a presidential pardon last year. Bannon, 68 years old, was released without bail after his arraignment on charges including money laundering, conspiracy, and fraud related to the We Build the Wall campaign. He is the second person pardoned by Trump and later charged by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for the same alleged conduct. That was from AP. Here is Steve Bannon as he was walking into the courthouse in New York City in handcuffs.
For every conservative American, this is what happens in the last days of a dying regime. They will never shut me up. They'll have to kill me first. I have not yet begun to fight.
Steve Bannon, former senior advisor to former President Donald Trump in New York City in the courthouse in handcuffs as he walked in and pleaded not guilty. This story from the Washington Post, the Justice Department said it would appeal the federal judge's decision to appoint a special master to sift through thousands of documents the FBI seized from Donald Trump's Florida residence on August 8th, according to a Thursday court filing. The notice of appeal arrived 3 days after the Judge Eileen M. Cannon ruled in favor of Trump and said she would appoint a special master, slowing, at least temporarily, an investigation into the possible mishandling of extremely sensitive classified information, as well as possible hiding, tampering, or destruction of government records. That from the Washington Post. Now to the U.S. economy. A story at the Wall Street Journal. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said the central bank is squarely focused on bringing down high inflation to prevent it from becoming entrenched, as it did in the 1970s. Chair Powell was interviewed today by the Cato Institute CEO, Peter Gettler.
You know, those of us who grew up in the 70s, I think that the danger and cost of inflation, can't be exaggerated. In September of 1979, his first testimony, a month after he was confirmed, Paul Volcker made clear he understood the damage that was being caused by inflation and the need to bring it down, even if it required great costs in other economic ways. One of the lessons of that episode was the greater the extent to which inflation slips the leash, the higher the cost and greater economic damage necessary to bring it under control. I worry whether we have the resolve to bring inflation under control today, to face the potential economic costs. I took some comfort from your recent remarks in Jackson Hole, which seemed an attempt to signal that kind of resolve. But I do remain concerned that, the intense political pressure that might be brought to bear to avoid collateral economic damage before the inflation fight is won. And I just wondered if there's any way you can help me sleep a little bit better on that score.
Sure. So I think it's worth going back and remembering, and I pointed this out in my remarks 2 weeks ago at Jackson Hole, 10 days ago, that what Paul Volcker did and the Fed did to finally get inflation under control followed several failed attempts to get inflation under control. And what had happened over the course of that long period of the Great Inflation is that the public had really come to think of higher inflation as the norm and to expect it to continue. And that's what made it so hard to get inflation down in that case. So it is very much our view and my view that we need to act now forthrightly, strongly, as we have been doing, and we need to keep at it until the job is done to avoid that. We think we can avoid the kind of very high social costs that Paul Volcker and the Fed had to bring into play in order to get inflation back down and set us up then for a long period of price stability. That speech, the point really there was to deliver a speech that was narrowly focused on inflation, more direct and a lot shorter than a typical Jackson Hole speech. And I thought that what was appropriate was a very, kind of concise and focused message. To your question, the message really was that the Fed has and accepts responsibility for price stability, by which we mean 2% inflation over time. That, again, to your question, the longer inflation remains well above target, the greater the risk that the public does begin to see higher inflation as the norm. And that has the capacity to really raise the costs of getting inflation down. So finally, history cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. I can assure you that my colleagues and I are strongly committed to this project, and we will keep at it until the job is done. I can also assure you that we never take into consideration external political considerations. We are accountable to the public through Congress. That's a very fundamental, important aspect of our work. But we do not. We focus solely on the goals that Congress has given us, and that's what we're going to do here.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell with the Cato Institute CEO Peter Gettler at a Cato Monetary Conference held today. The next Federal Reserve meeting, during which interest rates could rise again, is September 20th and 21st. On Wall Street, the Dow up 193, NASDAQ up 70, S&P up 26. The Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen traveling to a Ford Motor Company electric vehicle assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan today to highlight the more than $14 billion in its subsidies for electric vehicles in the recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act, the name the Democrats gave that law. And also the Treasury Secretary promising we will rid ourselves from our current dependence on fossil fuels.
Given the existential threat posed by climate change, it is imperative that we address it. Our plan, powered by the Inflation Reduction Act, represents the largest investment in fighting climate change in our country's history. And it will put us well on our way toward a future where we depend on the wind, the sun, and other clean sources of energy. We will rid ourselves from our current dependence on fossil fuels and the whims of autocrats like Putin. In policy terms, experts estimate this law puts the United States on a path to reducing emissions relative to 2005 levels by approximately 40% within the next 8 years. And that places President Biden's goal of cutting our emissions in half by 2030 well within reach. Now, there is much more work to do, but we can finally say to ourselves and to the world, we are on a path to a net zero emissions economy. I am proud the Treasury is at the forefront of implementing this plan. Today, countries representing around 90% of global GDP have made net zero commitments by mid-century or soon thereafter. By mobilizing private capital, the clean energy tax credits implemented by Treasury will propel our economy and workers to a leadership position in the fastest growing markets and technologies of today and of the future, with positive spillovers to the rest of the world. And this, of course, includes the U.S. clean vehicle sector, where we can expect greater investment and more good jobs like the ones here at Ford as we develop this supply chain here at home.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at the Ford Rouge Electric Vehicle Center, an assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan, today. Washington Today continues in a moment.
There are a lot of places to get political information, but only at C-SPAN do you get it straight from the source. No matter where you are from or where you stand on the issues, C-SPAN is America's network. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. If it happens here, or here, or here, or anywhere that matters, America is watching on C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now video app and wherever you get your podcasts. An article at thehill.com, a potential nationwide freight rail strike is looming, threatening to cripple the U.S. economy ahead of the holiday shopping season and November's midterm elections. Roughly 115,000 rail workers could walk off the job as soon as September 16th if they cannot agree on a new contract with railroads. We'll talk with the reporter that wrote that story in just a moment, but first, an organizer with the Railroad Workers United Union, Ron Camaco, tells the Working People podcast that most of their members want to reject a deal with the railroads negotiated by the PEB, or Presidential Emergency Board, and strike.
We just did a survey. 3,200 railroad workers who are party to the agreement did respond. 90 to 95% of them responded unfavorably to the PEB recommendations, stating they would not vote for a tentative agreement that was based upon those PEB recommendations. We also asked another question, would you think that railroad workers should be ready, willing, and able to exercise their right to strike? The percentage responding to that question was even higher, right around 95, 96%. And so there seems to be a consensus. I should just mention that in that survey, we also asked what union you were a member of. There were respondents from every union, roughly proportionate to the numbers who are party to the agreement. We asked people what their seniority bracket was, 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 30 or more, etc. And we also asked what your age group was, because a lot of times demographics and seniority and union and craft will determine whether you might be in favor or opposed to a tentative agreement. The long and the short is you can break down the data in the Excel spreadsheet, and basically any of the seniority groups, the age groups, or union affiliation, and you get 90 to 95% opposed to the recommendations of the PEB, and then once again, a 90 to 97% or so in favor of exercising our right to strike.
Ron Camaco is an organizer with the Railroad Workers United Union, speaking on the Working People podcast on the Real News Network. Karl Evers-Hillstrom is a business and lobbying reporter with The Hill. He has been following this story, and he joins us now by phone. Thank you so much. The first potential strike date just over a week away. Where do the negotiations stand?
Well, right now, we've had about 5 of the unions have come to sort of tentative agreements with the railroads. There's still another 8 unions that need to agree, and they make up kind of the bulk of the 115,000 workers who could potentially go on strike. And there hasn't been a ton of progress there. So if they're not, close to coming to a deal by Friday, there could be a situation where workers decide that it's time to strike.
What has been the Biden administration's involvement?
The Biden administration in July created a board, a presidential emergency board, which basically was formed to try to speed up these negotiations and kind of bring it to an end after years of very contentious negotiations. And last month, they released recommendations basically saying, offering pretty substantial pay raises, but that didn't address some of the other concerns about kind of rigorous working hours that rail workers have been asking for. So some of the unions have agreed to adopt those recommendations, while others are less excited about it. But the Biden administration really has just been trying to get a deal done at all costs. They do not want there to be sort of supply chain and economic issues happening. It was just a couple months before the midterms.
The headline on your article at thehill.com calls a potential strike kneecapping the U.S. economy. What is the potential impact here?
I mean, it would really grind large portions of the U.S. economy to a halt, quite literally. So we're talking about the transport of grain and other food products, crude oil, steel, car parts. These are some of the things that typically can't be transported by other means, especially with how stretched thin our supply chains are at the moment. There's no real backup plan for a lot of these goods. So, even if the strike was only for a day or two, that would have ripple effects. Agricultural goods would probably start to spoil. Containers would stack up at ports and really worsen the congestion we already have, which we've seen has led to higher prices. So it certainly seems like our supply chains are not robust enough at the moment to deal with sort of any kind of work stoppage.
We're talking with Karl Evers-Hillstrom with The Hill. You also write that Congress last acted to end a rail strike 30 years ago. What is the legal framework here for what could be done to prevent a strike legally?
So, 30 years ago, Congress last utilized really these almost ancient laws that give them the power to stop a strike and basically give them the power to kind of step in and decide what the new contract will be for rail workers. So if workers were to walk out, they could basically vote to implement the presidential board's recommendations as the new contract. They could appoint arbitrators to sort of fast track a new contract. They really have a lot of tools at their disposal, but as you mentioned, they haven't done this in 30 years. So I think some business groups are a little concerned at the moment that there's maybe not the expertise in this Congress about sort of how to go about that. So there's definitely a push to try to get lawmakers to kind of understand the direness of this situation.
And would President Biden himself need to be involved in that? If Congress were to act, would he have to sign that? Because the president is a very big fan of unions. He says it often.
Absolutely. He would need to be involved, and it would be going through the usual Senate and House process. That kind of is the interesting dynamic here, at least politically, is that Democrats want to make sure, I think, that rail workers get a deal that is fair to them, and I think a lot of folks are have sympathy that rail workers are, one of the few kinds of union workers that can't strike whenever they want to. That there's all of this kind of government intervention in the way. But I think it's going to be a bigger priority for Democrats and President Biden to make sure that no strike takes place, or if there is a strike, that it is blocked quickly, because just the economic damage resulting from it is just too big a risk, I think, politically for the Democrats.
Karl Evers-Hillstrom, business and lobbying reporter with The Hill. Find his stories at thehill.com, and he's on Twitter at Karl M. Evers. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Now to Russia's war in Ukraine. The New York Times reporting that Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken said during a visit to Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, on Thursday that he would notify Congress that the United States intends to send another $2 billion in long-term military support to Ukraine and 18 other countries that are at risk of a Russian invasion. Mr. Blinken's visit to Ukraine's foreign ministry was his second since the Russian invasion began. The State Department did not publicly disclose his travel in advance for security reasons. Separately, President Biden has approved a further $675 million in military support for Ukraine. Defense Secretary Lloyd J. Austin III said as the United States seeks to bolster Ukraine's defenses and its efforts to reclaim territory lost to Russia. The combined aid makes for a total of $13.5 billion in assistance to Ukraine from the Biden administration since Russia's invasion in February. That from the New York Times. Defense Secretary Austin made that announcement while in Germany at Ramstein Air Base, where he was meeting with the defense ministers of other nations known as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group.
We're here because we refuse to live in a world where big powers trample borders by force. Our support for Ukraine's bedrock right to defend itself doesn't waver based on any given clash. And ladies and gentlemen, the face of the war is changing, and so is the mission of this contact group. We will work together to train Ukraine's forces for the long haul. We will work together to help integrate Ukraine's capabilities and bolster its joint operations for the long haul. We'll work together to upgrade our defense industrial bases to meet Ukraine's requirements for the long haul. And we'll work together for production and innovation to meet Ukraine's self-defense needs for the long haul. Now we're seeing the demonstrable success of our common efforts on the battlefield. And every day we see the resolve of the allies and partners worldwide who are helping Ukraine resist Russia's illegal, imperial, and indefensible war of conquest. And we must evolve as the fight evolves. In the weeks since the contact group last met, the United States has committed another $6.3 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. And yesterday, the President approved the latest tranche of U.S. assistance to Ukraine, valued up to $675 million. And this is the Biden administration's 20th drawdown of equipment from U.S. stocks for the Ukraine since last August. The latest package includes more Gimlers, 105mm howitzers, artillery munitions, HARM missiles, Humvees, armored ambulances, anti-tank systems, small arms, and more.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in Germany, where the Ukraine Defense Contact Group held a meeting today. Secretary Austin chairs that group. The Defense Department says it has grown to more than 50 participating members. After the meeting, Secretary Austin and General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, held a news conference. General Milley giving an update on the effectiveness of the military aid to Ukraine so far.
Let me give you a very brief battlefield update. As you know, the Russians attacked beginning 24 February. So think in terms of 24 February to about the middle of April, the Russians continued a strategic attack to try to capture Kyiv, get to the Dnipro River, assault through the south out of Crimea into the Donbass, and then also potentially conduct an attack against Odessa. Those attacks failed. They didn't seize the capital, they didn't topple the government, they didn't get to the Dnipro River, and they didn't seize Odessa. So in the beginning of April, the Russians adjusted their war aim, and they consolidated their forces in the east in order to attack and seize all of the Donbass and hold Odessa at risk. They launched that offensive on or about the 15th or 16th of April, and they have been defeated in that. Their operational objectives in that offensive have not been successful. They have not achieved all of the Donbass, and they have only crossed the Dnipro River in the south in the vicinity of Kherson. So their operational aims, in addition to their strategic aims, have been defeated by a very successful defense conducted by Ukraine. At the beginning of this month, on or about the 1st of September, Ukraine launched an offensive in order to seize the operational and strategic initiative. That offensive is ongoing. That offensive is in its early stages, and it's too early to give a full assessment. But to date, Ukraine is effectively using their fires to shape the ground maneuver as they continue their offensive in the south. And what we're talking about is the area just north of the Dnipro River in the vicinity of Kherson.
General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at a news conference in Germany alongside Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. Reuters reports Ukraine has recaptured more than 700 square kilometers, that's 270 square miles, of its territory in the east and south during a lightning counteroffensive, a Ukrainian general said on Thursday, offering the first official assessment of the operation. The U.S. CIA Director William Burns says the way U.S. intelligence was declassified and warning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, that could be repeated in the future to expose other threats, but he says don't expect it to become the usual practice. Director Burns was interviewed today at the Billington Cybersecurity Summit in Washington, D.C.
Could you also talk about the decision to declassify intelligence on Russia and Ukraine and what that means for other major issues, including cyber challenges?
Yeah, I mean, decisions to declassify intelligence are always very complicated ones, but I think when President Biden has decided very carefully and very selectively to, make public some of our secrets, it's played a very effective role over the course of the last 6 months, and I think it can continue to, again, if we make it the exception, not the rule, because the surest way I've certainly found in a year and a half now as director of CIA to lose access to good intelligence is to be reckless about how you handle it. But in this instance, I think it's been a very important means of denying Vladimir Putin something that I've watched him employ too often in the past, which is creating false narratives, trying to blame the Ukrainians, to create false provocations in the run-up to the war. And I think what we were able to do, working with our allies and partners, is to expose the fact that Putin's war is a naked, unprovoked aggression as well. And I think that's played, that very selective, very careful declassification has played an effective role. Again, I think we're going to have to be careful looking at other instances, whether it's in terms of cyber threats or other kind of challenges that the United States and our allies will face in the future. But I think, again, if used carefully and selectively, I think this technique, this tool of declassifying some of our secrets in a way that serves a broader strategy can pay big dividends.
The CIA Director William Burns at the Billington Cybersecurity Summit in Washington, D.C. today. Director Burns also said nearly 1/3 of all of CIA's officers work every day on issues related to cybersecurity, technology, science, and digital information. CNN is reporting that former CNN anchor Bernard Shaw died Wednesday of pneumonia unrelated to COVID-19. Shaw's family announced in a statement Thursday. Shaw was 82. They go on, Shaw was CNN's first chief anchor and was with the network when it launched on June 1st, 1980. He retired from CNN after more than 20 years on February 28, 2001. During his storied career, Shaw reported on some of the biggest stories of the time, including the student revolt in Tiananmen Square in March 1989, First Gulf War live from Baghdad in 1991, and the 2000 presidential election. That reporting from CNN. About a week after his retirement in 2001, Bernard Shaw was interviewed by another former journalist, Marvin Kalb, and one topic was a famous, some say infamous, question that Bernard Shaw asked Democratic presidential candidate Michael Dukakis during a debate in 1988. We'll hear the question and answer from 1988 and then his response in 2001. First, here is the part of that debate.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have had the biggest drop in crime of any industrial state in America, why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America.
Democratic presidential candidate Michael Dukakis in 1988, the question from the CNN anchor Bernard Shaw. Michael Dukakis then running against the Republican candidate, then Vice President George H.W. Bush. Fast forward to 2001, here's Bernard Shaw talking about that moment.
His answer, I don't think, categorically affected the outcome of that race.
Right.
I really don't believe that.
But it did have an impact on journalism.
Well, I was doing my job as a journalist. The flood of hate mail and criticism I got from people who didn't like the question was driven by something that they really had forgotten. And it goes like this. Since when did a question hurt a politician? When? A question? It wasn't the question, it was the answer.
Absolutely.
And his staff had prepared him for that kind of question.
They knew in advance? No.
No, they did not. They didn't know in advance, but they had, you know how you sit around and you brainstorm, and it's just like the president preparing for a press conference. The staff will come in and they'll sit around and say, well, you might get a question on this or that kind of thing, because he had had assaults in his family, you know, his brother, his dad. They say that he wasn't feeling that well the day of the debate, that he was running a fever, that he had the flu and all that. But all I can tell you is that after the debate, Governor Dukakis, after shaking hands with me and the other panelists, walked off stage, and John Sasso, his campaign manager, was waiting in the wings. And as he stepped into the wings, he said to John, and I cannot use this word, it's a very profane word, but it begins with an F. He said, John, I up. But before we leave this subject, that was not a grenade across the stage question. I worked 2 days on that question.
No, I know.
That one question. The question was related to the issues of the campaign. George Bush had called him the Iceman twice in the campaign. Mm-hmm. Our polling showed that people didn't doubt that the governor was a competent public servant, but they didn't feel anything. And American voters like to feel something about their president. Capital punishment was an issue in the campaign. Mm-hmm. The famous Willie Horton ad was very prominent. And I felt that it was a valid question.
Former CNN anchor Bernard Shaw in 2001, right after he retired from that network, in a conversation with former journalist Marvin Kalb. That from C-SPAN's video library. It was announced today that Bernard Shaw has died at the age of 82. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. You can sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.